does not plan to use the shared Etherpad. It's just not the way she likes to take minutes, but be assured she is capturing things. Do we have somebody that would want to volunteer to bring comments to the mic in case somebody wants to have something brought from Jabber but can't do audio? Sucks. Adam's going to take that. Thank you, Adam. So the Codian D-pad is available. If anybody has anything that they want to capture, feel free to put things on that page. I will make sure they get integrated into whatever final minutes we produce. At risk of, it's hard to watch the room to see if we're still getting lots of joins. And it looks like there are some folks that are still having to try to get in but are having problems. So
yeah, we're missing
a couple of seconds more.
We're missing at least one, and in the past 3 seconds, the number's gone up 2. We should probably go ahead and get started.
Okay. We're at the end of the week, but in case you haven't seen this before, pay attention to it. It describes your responsibilities and the conditions for participating in this process. Here's our agenda today. Our first, we've gone through getting the minute takers and Jabber scribes. The blue sheets are going to be taken care of for us automatically. Does anybody have any changes to the agenda that they want to suggest? I'm not hearing any. Chris, are you here? I'm not seeing Chris in the roster yet.
I just messaged Chris, so hopefully he'll be coming.
Okay. Did Martin make it in?
Don't see Martin either. We could just do the update on the post-working group last call documents first, if you.
Yeah.
I mean.
So we'll accept that agenda bash. So that takes us to. Well, go ahead, John. Start that in audio. Do I need to? I'm just hunting for the right slide.
Yeah.
This isn't this slide, is it? Is this where I need to start?
No, it's diversion plus OOB. Sent you 2 separate prezos.
Diversion plus OOB. Which called data passport extension. I'm not. Did it get uploaded?
Pretty sure.
Yeah. Diversion plus OOB. So there's the service provider OOB. So it.
Yeah, it's a separate prezo. Pretty sure they both got uploaded, but I mean, my tool use is not always as scrupulous as it should be.
No, this is a great way to start.
Great way to start. I mean, I can just kind of speak to those too.
Yes, please.
There is a little bit of substance around the post IHT review divert stuff. But I mean, in terms of OOB, obviously, like OOB is in the RFC editor queue. And probably several of you this week have heard that there exists such a thing as a cluster 238, which is a group of roughly 40 documents the RFC editor is currently in the process of jointly getting released. And as a consequence of that, OOB is just kind of sitting there, but it's pretty much done at this point. Divert, on the other hand, had a great number of comments and a few substantive discusses, especially from the security area. And we have now resolved those, so that document is passed to the ISG. The main thing that is actually in the divert draft that we changed to accommodate one of Roman's comments actually was a bit more text about DEVO. For those of you that don't remember the long and sordid history of diversion in OOB and interaction, we've gone through a few phases with divert, where we looked at doing it either as a separate passport that would be added to a separate identity header that would appear in addition to an original identity header when we're going to do a diversion, or versions where it was actually nested. And the nesting of the original passport within the diversion passport is something we did with a separate passport type that is called DEVO. There we go. There's the slides. So maybe if you go to like the second one. And then the third one. I already spoke to that. There we go. And so again, the main fix was that because, we kind of left a bit of dissonance maybe between the OB spec and the divert spec in terms of the handling of DEVO. It was unclear kind of where the burden for explicating DEVO should ultimately fall. The text about how especially authentication service and verification service behavior for DEVO worked wasn't super fleshed out in the version of the spec that the ISG reviewed. And this was Roman's comment. And so I fleshed that out a bit, and I did want to call the working group's attention to that because there's a couple of paragraphs of text that I added. And this text is very high level. It's intended to discuss DEVO, not even necessarily for the OOB use case, but for any using protocol that wants to try to carry passports that might actually want to be able to use this nesting function. And indeed, the op field that is defined by DEVO is intended to be useful for virtually any application that would happen to want to do nesting with passports, not merely for diversion itself. And so I added a bit of text just about like kind of what authentication and verification services do in general to work on DEVO when they receive it. And that's the main switch, but please do read it if you care, because it is a little different. There are even normative statements, and you see there's a parenthetical question to the chairs here. Is this something that we want to actually like bring back to the working group and do some formal, 2-week, hey, please take a look? I think it's frankly pretty, pretty high level. It's not super prescriptive what the text is that was added. So yeah, that's my question to the chairs. What do you guys want to do about that? Given the choices of we either, have some formal process to review it for a couple weeks before we give, thumbs up. Obviously, we have plenty of time to wait, given the RFC editor queue is at the moment. Or do you want to, just kind of tell people they can read it if they feel like it?
I think that things have been out there to gather feedback. If you're concerned, I'm not particularly concerned, but if you're concerned that we aren't getting people's attention and that they're looking, we can put down a formal artifact and a deadline.
I don't know. It's a couple of paragraphs of new text, and it basically is like high level, authentication services when they're looking at this in general should it's pretty much the procedures we previously described, but here's some high level guidance. So it's not super prescriptive.
Mm-hmm. So I'll just send a reminder note to the list, and if it's going to take some time for things to fall out, so people will have time to comment. But I don't think that we need to take this through anything as formal as a post last call review. So,
cool. Sounds good to me. So, I mean, the only other things we really changed, we changed the IANA registrations a bit to be in better conformance with JOT standards for that. We had a ton of good editorial fixes, but I think it seems to be in pretty good shape, and that we can safely call this one off our plate. Next slide. Except for one thing, which is Jack raised a couple of comments on the list about the circumstances in which we should trust DIV. And this really comes down ultimately to the questions of, if you're a relying party and you're receiving, a SIP invite that has an original passport and a DIV in it, there is always an opportunity for someone who is a retargeting, forwarding entity in this instance to, retain passports. They could be replayed. They could, potentially, if improper, security is used in the transmission of the invite overall, these could be potentially captured by an eavesdropper and so on. And, kind of what's to prevent someone from just taking an original passport, like creating a signed DIV for it, and sending it along to a party in order to try to persuade that party that it's the original caller's ID that should show up in the caller ID on the terminating side. And, if the DIV passport validates, if all the expiry timers are okay, what's to prevent some naive, terminating service provider or UE from kind of blithely trusting that? And this is a complicated question. I mean, the position that I articulated on the list was that really, I believe it is incumbent upon relying parties to trust everyone who signs passports. And that really, we in the IETF here aren't typically in the business of telling, people who they should trust or why, but that, this has to be a factor in the evaluation of DIV. And Jack rightly points out, I mean, that's potentially complicated, right? The degree to which the STIR-shaken implementation in particular within the closed network of the IPNI is predicated on, a pretty closed system of trust, of enrollment, and there's significant accountability for the actors that generate DIV. In that kind of environment, I'm not super worried about attacks like this, especially because non-carrier entities are not exactly getting access to passports in the shaken IPNI environment. And that as a consequence of that, I think the risks are relatively minimal. Nonetheless, I mean, we could add some, clarificatory text to the document that speaks to just kind of what you need for trust in general. I think we say this in the baseline STIR specs a lot already. And so, I mean, I kind of take it as granted from the security considerations of 8224 and 8225. But I mean, I wanted to open this one up to the floor, and Jack, feel free if I mischaracterized your point about this utterly to jump in on this, or anybody else has any opinions about kind of what to do about all this. I can say my concrete proposal would be do nothing, but Jack, go on.
I was actually just gonna say that summarizes what I was thinking quite well. The only thing that's awkward is the fact that the telephone numbers that are doing the redirections might not be quite as trusted. But again, it's kind of a thing that you're expecting the service providers to deal with that mostly.
I mean, in the shaken environment, we certainly anticipate that, right? That it's only the service providers who have even access to this information, right? And what you probably are going to see at a UE is no more than a Verstab. And as a consequence of that, I mean, the practical implications of this for the immediate implementations of STIR-shaken, I think, are small. That much said, I mean, I've said for some time, I hope to get to a world where, UEs are themselves able to consume passports. And, I don't think that is too sci-fi of a use case to consider. And so we do want to make sure we get it right, that we don't close the door on that working.
Yeah, and I guess it's worth asking the question is it fine for when you're in the situation where when UEs can access the passports, is it fine for STIR to not work very well if there isn't end-to-end encryption, which I think is what this position kind of means.
Right, and just to expand that a bit for those that aren't following this discussion, I mean, the good news is any of these impersonation attacks or an intermediary is attempting to, you know, spoof that the originating called number, right, is the actual caller, you know, provided that the original passport uses MKey and that DTLS SRTP is actually used for the media. I mean, of course, none of these attacks would work, right? And I guess, yeah, in my head, I imagine that were STIR ever to get down to that UE level, we would have something SIP brandy-ish, right, that we would be doing between user agents. And as a consequence of that, you would get that protection from that. And so I think that we have that covered. Now, again, DTLS SRTP implementation for SIP overall has not been as widespread as we hoped, to put it mildly. But, you know, I think any environment where things did get down to that UE level, where there were widespread SIP implementations that did that, yeah, I can't imagine that they wouldn't have that available to them. Anybody else have any feelings about this? Mr. Wendt. Mr. Rosen.
Yes, have to grant him mic permissions. Chris, go ahead.
Okay.
You should be in, Chris.
Okay, he's in.
Can you hear me?
Hey, Chris.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. I don't know if this is, I'm just curious how, if calls get down to the UE level, how much diversion is going to be going on there? Are you going to depend on a phone to be on all the time to forward a call, or is that always going to be a network feature? You know, I mean, I'm not trying to use that as any excuse, but just curious what you think there.
Well, obviously, I think this is much more a network feature. Indeed, forwarding usually happens when the UE isn't available, right? And that's kind of like the Sanya case. And this is much more about the attacker and what the attacker's powers are. And
Right.
so, like, if somebody's intentionally being malicious and
Yeah,
they
exactly.
manage to get a passport and they decide to re-originate, I wouldn't want to discount a use case. I wouldn't want to make it, I guess, impossible for UE to implement like a call forwarding app on it. I mean, it's kind of not a great app, but at the same time, we need a story for this. I think the story is MKey.
Yeah, the attacker with its own SIP client is certainly a much better thing to focus on. Yep. Thanks.
Brian?
Brian, you should be able to go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, man.
Okay. So it wouldn't hurt to point out that the M key is useful in this circumstance, because it may not be obvious to somebody reading the document that that is the protection for this particular circumstance. So if you just mention it, just point back to the original discussion, then I think that what you're proposing is the right way forward. I don't think we need anything else.
Sold. I think that's a great idea. Why don't we do that? All right, so I'll patch together a little text, and I will put that in and draw the attention of the group to it, and sometime between now and when the document is supposed to be published, giving the group ample time to review it. All right, I think we're good on this one, unless there are any other comments. So next slide. So yeah, we have the certificate delegation document as well, which concluded Working Group last call. I can't say there was a ton of eyeballs on it, but Russ's eyes, I think, were actually intensely gazing at it for a bit there. And although it took me a little bit to get around to it, those pictures, I believe, should be in. I don't know, Russ, if you had a chance to look at them. I may have missed it on the list if you did, but.
I think that was Russ's phone that just went off.
I see. So,
I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
yeah. So I think it's all pretty good there. So I assume that if it is, and again, I took the text out of the Jabber log from the last interim and patched that in and tried to address, I think, all of the other things that you proposed. I think I don't recall anything that I didn't put in, but definitely take a look. But pending that, I think this is probably good to advance.
Yeah, so we'll give Russ a chance to see if his comments have been addressed. I read through the DIS, it all looked good to me. So I believe that we're in that same state unless Russ sees an additional problem.
I'll look next week.
Sounds good. I think with that, we're done. I don't think there's anything else in this prezzo.
All right.
We can go back and unbash the agenda.
Yeah, let me do a little bit of media straightening out.
Yeah, let me get out of the video and the audio.
Chris, you might be ready to talk. We're going to go to the RPH. Come on, guys. The select window to share is not giving me the right option now, so hang on just a second. And Russ, this is why I wanted to do the combined slide thing.
I think
Here
the
we
tabs
go.
thing would have saved us some time.
Yeah, well, that particular app did terrible machine things to my machine. I did install it and then had to spend half an hour undoing the damage that it did. All right.
So we have our AD in the queue. Maybe we should find out what he wants to talk about. Go ahead, Marie. Oh, you dropped out. Okay. You're back.
Sorry, I'm getting used to the interface. I just noticed that delegation doesn't have a shepherd. Have you picked one?
So Russ and I will work that out between us.
Okay, just curious. Thanks.
Chris, you should be able to speak. Yep.
Yep. He's
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Great. Okay, so this is an update for resource priority header. Between the last meeting and this meeting, we met offline with Brian and others to discuss, aligning some of the things that he had in his document. And I think the result of that, I guess you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is some of the background. I guess I could go through that if people aren't aware of it. RPH is related to resource priority header, and specifically for this document, we're talking about emergency services calls, which are both emergency service call origination. Somebody dials 911 or the appropriate emergency services number in their geography, and then also the callbacks that can happen from 911 back to the person. Next page. Yeah, so this is where we were before, but as I started to say prematurely, go to the next page. Yeah, so we discussed adding SIP priority, not resource priority, but priority, which is used for callbacks with a value of PSAP callback. And Brian, you can correct me if I'm misstating anything, but hopefully I think I got it. So the simple answer we had was just to add a new claim to the RPH passport, which is SPH, and decided to assign a value of PSAP callback to make it straightforward. And the purpose of that would be if the PSAP uses the priority header and assigns a value of PSAP callback, then we can protect its usage. So nobody tries to use PSAP callback to assign some priority to a call that it shouldn't be. Next page. So this is essentially what a callback call would look like. It would include both the resource priority identifier that puts it in ESNet space, and then in addition, if the SIP priority header is used, it would include that claim as well. So yeah, I think hopefully that resolves something. I don't know if Brian, if you think there's anything else you can provide comment, but you know, certainly would like to get other people to review it. Brian, you want to?
Yeah, this is good. For those of you who haven't followed any of this, which I assume is most of you, there is 7090 defines a marking for callbacks, and this is used to make sure that, for example, if you call from 911 from a specific device and they call you back using your telephone number, that the call reaches the device that made the original emergency call and not your voicemail system. This marking using the priority header, the SIP priority header, is fairly well established at this point. The 3GPP guys wanted it, and in it we chose to use the priority header. We use the resource priority header for actual priority within networks. Typically, you don't get much priority for emergency calls, but networks that can give you some priority have a marking. They know what emergency calls are. There's a universal marking for that. But specifically specifying an RPH value is useful, and using the ESNet namespace, which is what the original work did. But being able to also bring in the SIP priority header so that we can protect the callbacks is important. And this does what we discussed in the offline meeting, and I'm happy with it. And I think it's going to be just what we need to handle both calls to emergency services and calls back from emergency services. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
So do you think that there are any additions that are still coming to this draft, or do you think it's essentially in a state that all it needs to be left is dedicated review and polish?
I think as far as I'm aware, it has most of the substantive things that should be in there. It's also been reviewed in the IPN&I by and I think by 3GPP folks as well. So I think there's been, you know, in terms of substance, there's been enough review to hopefully move forward, unless there's any last minute things that anybody can identify. But yeah, I think we're pretty much ready to go.
And does anyone in the room feel like this is not ready for working group last call? I'm not hearing anything or seeing anyone new in the queue. So we'll go ahead and queue this for working group last call and be sure that we get some dedicated reviews.
Thank you.
So this is going to take us back to
I think now he's going to pinch hit for Martin.
No, that's what I just did.
That's what we just did. We can
RC.
go back to, yeah, the passport RCD.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry, my computer was beach balling as I was joining. So.
all right, so you should be good to go.
Yep, so for RCD, I didn't do any updates to the RCD draft. I didn't receive any comments specific to that. I think we, again, in terms of substance, we're pretty good with where we are in the actual draft. But we do reference, and we've talked about it in the last few meetings, a update to call info that is still an individual draft, unfortunately. But I'll talk through that. There's 2 and 3. So why don't you go to the next slide? This is probably the, one thing that I'd like to get some eyes on in terms of example to make sure that it looks correct in terms of the usage of the scheme, the URI scheme in 2392, where we would include the, we talked about in call info, how do we include the JCard or any RCD content in the body of the SIP invite via the reference. So yeah, any comments there would be appreciated. Hopefully we got that correct. Next page. One other thing to note, I happened to notice that in call info spam, reason was already used, so I changed reason to call reason, so that obviously it would be unique. The other things I did in the draft were fill out what at least I felt were relevant JCard fields that people may use going into the future. There was a bunch of them that really didn't make much sense, although I don't know if we would specifically restrict them. I'd sort of like to get some feedback on what people think about. I put must with all of them. I didn't go through and think about, like, are there some that should be shoulds and some that should be musts, or how we think that should work going forward. I think it's really a matter of like how we think people will render these things on the devices if they're passed. So, I didn't know if we wanted to try to do that in this document or not. John, you have a comment there?
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty, I think this is really an interoperability question as much as it is kind of a baseline, what do we hope people will do question. Right. Yep. I think it's pretty important that we identify fields that we want every receiving party to be able to understand, and kind of draw that as the line between, the must, the should, and the mays for support of this. Right. And so I think, I think that's probably pretty easy to come up with, things that we want to make sure that if they're sent, then receivers are gonna be able to handle them and figure out some way to render them to users. Yeah.
I mean, in the initial discussions, people are talking mostly about logo, well, name, obviously, and then logo and reason are as ones that seem to be the top priorities. But I can see adding others as time goes on, and depending how people feel about receiving that type of information along with their call. I forget, do I have another page? Yep. So I think, John and I have been talking about getting more conversation on the individual draft, and haven't initiated that yet, so we do need to do that. So that's a dependency going forward, but I guess I'm looking for suggestions on how we move forward other than that.
John, you should be able to go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the RCD draft is pretty stable at this point. I mean, this is something that we should be trying to figure out how to get that to exit the working group. I agree, we do need to start the SIPCORE conversation, and there are just deep ties between these things. So if SIPCORE is going to totally barf all over this, that would be an issue. But I mean, frankly, we've moved most of the work in terms of specifying how we're using JCARD and so on over to that SIPCORE draft at this point. And so all that's really left in the RCD document is talking about how to sign that information that is present in the baseline SIP stuff that's in call info, which I think is the right actual delineation. That's the way I like STIR to work, where we're really just figuring out how to sign over fields that are part of the base SIP semantics. Given that there isn't actually that much of a dependency, like if people are going to complain about this field shouldn't be mandatory or whatever in the SIPCORE draft, it's not like much would change about the STIR draft, the RCD draft. And as a consequence of that, I'm pretty comfortable moving in parallel to advance this as we then go to SIPCORE and get them to take a look at it.
Yeah, I think the major things to review are the integrity things that are in the RCD draft. I think the other thing is more about defining the claims. But Brian, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Speaking as SIPCORE chair, our workload is not particularly high, so it's a fairly good time to try and put work in, and we can get moving on it pretty quickly.
Okay.
I do, just echoing what you said, I think what you've done here is much better than what you started out with. The deciding how we want to do this kind of a transfer of information is a SIP thing, not a STIR thing. And I want this. I would like the SIP experts to weigh in on this, on that part, and then signing it so that it gets to the other, so that that it hasn't been messed with in transit. Great, that's the STIR part. So I'm particularly appreciative of how you rejiggered this. It looks much better than the original.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's provides some compatibility with other approaches, like we talked in the past. ECNAME and others that use call info. So
yes.
Yeah. I see John in Jabber indicates that we'll send something to the SIPCORE list. So I'm taking the we in that case is you and Chris, John. Yep. Arrow pointing to John. So all right. So where does this leave us in our agenda? I think that we might be on to any other business at this point. So Brian did send me slides this morning. I uploaded them about a half an hour before the meeting. I intended to have everything up earlier than that, but Brian's slides are in the data tracker. If you haven't looked recently, you need to go back and look again. I will shift over to them now. So,
while you're shifting,
you.
While you're shifting, I just wanted to ask, so, I mean, is there any RCD action? So basically, is the next step for STIR, we're just going to park RCD pending support discussion?
I believe that's the right thing to do. Instead of trying to work in group, let's call it while that discussion is happening, in case there are changes that come along that actually made a difference on what bits what the bits looked like we would sign over. We might as well wait.
Okay, but basically, do we need any kind of review of this until then? Probably not, I guess. Let's just wait for the support thing. It makes sense.
So I'm running into a small Metaco bug that I will report, but I have to offer to share my screen, and then it doesn't show me all the available windows. So I have to pick, to decline it, then refuse to share my screen, and then offer to share it again. At which point,
in the meantime, let's let Jonathan come to the mic. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right, excellent. All right, so Jonathan Rosenberg, 5'9". I admit I've not been doing a lot on the list discussion with Rich Call data draft, but I mostly wanted to, I did give it a skim. One of my concerns / comments is making sure it works well for enterprise use cases. One of the things that's not at all clear to me from the document is how you deal with the fact that some of the information will be provided by the originating enterprise, which may or may not be signed. Reason for call obviously being a big one. If you think of an enterprise, a contact center, that's going to be highly dynamic based on the campaigns and other properties of the enterprise call center, and not known by the authenticating carrier. So how does that work? Because that's that's call reason, for example, which is pretty critical for contact centers. It's in the signature. So how does the carrier trust it? Do they receive it from the enterprise? That bit of it, I just, again, maybe I missed in the document. I apologize if I did, but does it cover this case?
Chris, you have the floor.
I think John might have got on first, but I can respond too. Yeah, I think that is very much the intention of this, and I think the policy of who can sign is being very much discussed in other forums. So, and it's specifically for enterprise and call centers to allow to do this. There's other discussions, and I think we've actually had that discussion in this working group as well, about the policies around, making sure that the logos and other things are appropriate, and vetting of that information beyond just the vetting of the companies that are utilizing this information. There's one school of thought that this would be used in conjunction with certificate delegation. I forget if we explicitly say that in there, but that's really the intent. Although, we want this to be a general mechanism, but like in terms of industry, that's what we've been talking about.
Okay, it's still unclear to me how and maybe this is just outside the scope of this document, but there's a step where if you assume the enterprise isn't using delegation, then it has to send what it thinks the data is that it knows about to the carrier, and then there's a separate part about how the authentication service decides what information from the enterprise it's willing to vouch for and put into the passport, which would presumably be a subset of the J card and the call info header or something. Right. A process like that, at least, again, unless I missed it, I didn't see described in the document.
Yeah, I guess part of the issue is, making sure that if you put this identity header, RCD identity header, in your SIP invite, to make sure that it gets to the other side and all the policies that are involved in making sure that nobody drops it or anything, if that's your intention.
And we did put the call reason in particular in a separate scope of protection than the data like the logos, for exactly this reason, that we imagine that would be more dynamic. And a lot of this goes into, it does relate to certificate delegation, into the use of JWT constraints in certs that you would issue to an enterprise. And there's a bit of text about that in there. And that's intended to create this delineation where, a vetting agency that either is a carrier or works on behalf of a carrier, for example, could be responsible for making sure, okay, this number is actually, Bronx Pizza, and this is the Bronx Pizza logo, and everything here is good. But the call reason part is intentionally left out of that scope of protection, so that could be set dynamically by enterprises. So there are mechanisms in there that are intended to try to accommodate that kind of difference in the scope. But a lot of that, again, comes down to how the JWT constraints in particular interact with passport creation, which is probably something we could talk about offline. It's a little complicated, and I know we've got more presentations here, but there are some allowances for that.
Okay. All right. I just want to make sure that the draft clearly articulates that there is an intended applicability to the case where some amount of effectively unverified information by the authentication, like information is received by the authentication service from the enterprise or call center, which is not signed and is desired to be passed on. A subset of that is signed, the rest is passed on. Like just this use case is clearly described and supported by the document. I'm happy to give it a deeper read and even send some more specific comments.
Yeah, definitely read the JWT constraint specific stuff, and that's where you'll see kind of how this is supposed to interact with delegation.
Okay.
All right, Brian, you want to talk about the emergency calls draft? I assume Brian's still with us. You know, he may have been called away from the meeting. Much as I hate to struggle with this, but at least now I know how I can do it quickly. I will shift back until Brian comes back and let John work on the. I think this was be where we were. Does this work for you, John?
Works for me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so this is one actually that I had for last time, but because we had so much to do last time, I don't think we actually got around to talking about it then. But this is a new document, and this is a follow-on to the OB specification, the informational spec that, as I mentioned earlier, it's now residing in the RC editor queue. Now that is just an informational document. It's intended to create a framework and a baseline semantics about how one could do STIR out of band. What we mean by that is really STIR that is not being conveyed by SIP invite, usually because end-to-end SIP does not transit properly in the environment under consideration. And so as long as we believe that's a use case, as I commonly say, that we care about, having some kind of out-of-band way of conveying passports would be handy. And so this document is our first attempt really then to wrap a more concrete protocol and implementation around how you could do out-of-band to solve particular use cases that people are actually in the marketplace today already pursuing pretty aggressively. And the idea around this is a usage that's specific to service providers, and in particular to service providers who are willing to operate their own CPS, their own call placement service. And the call placement service is basically a web service where passports can be stored and subsequently retrieved by terminating entities when they want to recover the passport for a call that comes in without any passport for whatever reason. And the basic idea behind this draft, and this is an idea, so we're floating this here, and I'm really shopping for whether or not people think this is an idea that is worth working on here in the IETF. There is already work about it in other places as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that going forward. But the basic idea is to adopt a more constrained environment than the original informational out-of-band framework stipulated. And in particular, what could you do differently from a security perspective if you assume that it is in fact the terminating service provider who is operating the CPS? There's a ton of text that's in the out-of-band RFC that is about how you can have a third-party service that's not connected to either the originating or the terminating side, and how you can prevent that entity from learning kind of who's calling who. Well, in the case where the CPS is actually run by one of those entities, they know who's calling who. And so a lot of the kind of privacy-related text along those lines doesn't apply so much when you look at this through the service provider lens. And that's why I thought it was such an interesting one to pursue as potential concrete proposed standard implementation of OOB. So next slide. As I said, this will use roughly the ObRest interface that was originally described in the out-of-band framework, with the assumption that it will be the terminating service provider who runs the CPS. This will obviate the need for encryption of the passports. The kind of hard edge on this, I guess, is the gatewaying problem. There are cases where, because a lot of these cases are either SIP to PSTN or PSTN to SIP cases, where there just is some smart capacity, some internet-enabled service that can be accessed by the termination on the PSTN side, whether I guess whether it's the origination or the termination, something that lives on the internet that is accessible to the endpoint that is otherwise, say, entirely SS7. When you have that, then you can figure out how to discover it, send the passport to it, and the gateways that you enroll to handle the intermediary stage. If, for example, traditional in-band STIR-shaken is where the call originates, those gateways could be responsible for storing the CPS if you don't want to place the burden on like every participant in shaken to have their own authentication services go off and store this at the terminating CPS. There are a variety of things we can do for gateways to kind of enroll them in this architecture and to allow them to be eligible to store passports at the terminating CPS. One thing that this does require, which is a new concept, and this is probably where the bulk of the actual protocol design work would need to be done for this, is in this concept of a CPS advertisement, of having some kind of a document. Exactly where the document lives probably depends on the trust models of the STIR network that is utilizing this. I imagine CPS advertisements could literally, reside at a centralized directory service. They could be embedded into certificates themselves even. You can imagine a cert kind of telling you for all calls that are supposed to go to this particular network, to the holder of this cert, here's the CPS, or at least here's a bootstrapping URL that'll help you learn what the CPS is for that network. Something, though, that is tied into whatever the trust anchor is. I think that's the crucial component of the CPS advertisement. And it would be a very simple JSON document that would just be showing mappings between TN auth lists and potential CPS URLs. But the work here, insofar as there really is work, would be in stipulating that, and maybe in doing anything further we need to do to get the REST interface up to spec beyond what's in the framework. Chris, do you have a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I wasn't gonna not say anything, of course. I guess I've said this in other forums, but the concept of the CPS being in the terminating service provider is a little bit new, or maybe that's, I don't know if you've been thinking that for a while or what, but at least newer to me. The problem I see with that is, if I'm going to set up a bunch of connections to CPSs distributed throughout various service provider environments, and like for a service provider like Comcast, where we have national footprint and geographic concerns about sending things to places that make sure that passports can get distributed. What I fear is, like, why send an HTTP request when I can just send a SIP invite over IP to a bunch of advertised, interconnection points and call it a day? Like, I'm wondering, are we solving the problem twice if we're sending invites and I realize they're going through TDM links, but like, if we have to create this overlay network, why not just go ahead and create the VoIP network in the first place?
So I think part of it is, so when I talked about gateways, I didn't really go deeply into the gateway use cases for this, but I mean, a case like Comcast, where you are just sending invites with passports, if they're going to end up in the PSTN, it might not be Comcast's responsibility, but instead the gateway's responsibility to be the entity that actually places the passport in the terminating CPS. And I mean, there are ways to implement this that are very IPNNI like, right? Where, really, if you assume that there is, a massive IPNNI and then a number of small islands of PSTN, placing a gateway that exists purely for this purpose in front of those access points that send this to the SS7 network. I mean, I think it pretty much has the exactly the architecture that you're speaking to. So this draft isn't really going to talk to how the IPNNI should do this. Like, there is an IPNNI draft talking about how to do this in the IPNNI that has, I think, very similar properties. So, I mean, this is much more looking at a high level at what the security differences are. If you assume that, again, the CPS is not something that is a third party that you're trying to conceal data from, but instead, an entity that is tightly coupled with either the origination or the termination of the call, and what the consequences of that are for what the security requirements are incumbent upon, like the protocol to deliver. And since they seem much easier and more favorable in this case, I just thought it was worth documenting like that, right? Like, what really are the security pieces that you don't have to do if you assume something like that is true?
Sure. Yeah, and I think, the gateway approach obviously makes the problem more tractable because, it's a smaller set of folks that are connecting to CPSs. But I just wanted to make that point and make sure we're thinking from that perspective as well.
Well, so I think we think from that perspective when we look at North America. But, as I know you and I have discussed before, other places where solutions like this are under consideration are, for example, in the GSMA, in the Vines working group there, which is part of their fraud and security group, that is looking at how to implement this in international mobile. And like they have a lot of the same kinds of problems. And their problems are, that intermediary networks in various environments are not trusted. And they need to have a back channel that can go around them in those environments. And so when I'm writing about this, I am thinking about not just Shaken, not just Pure Stir, but like what some of these other potential use cases are for it, and what we would need to be able to implement a system like this there.
Right.
And that's why I'm kind of leveling a bit on it, rather than getting into, yes, if you just did gateways, this is all simple. In the GSMA case, probably gatewaying doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Well, international is a whole nother thing, and I agree. If I mean, you could make the same argument, I guess, for countries that may not adopt STIR as something, and you have to have a gateway to figure out trust boundaries and things like that as well. But yeah, I just wanted to bring up that perspective. Thank you.
Sure. Anything else in this one, or shall we go to the next slide? Next slide. Yeah, so this is just a picture. It's very similar to the usual OOB picture, except in this instance, the CPS is kind of coupled to the terminating side. And we talk about this a bit in the text of whether the CPS could be literally composed with the VS to a degree that, there's no need for an interface between the OOB VS and the CPS. And then there are models where the CPS pushes passports it receives down to an OBVS because it knows that they are targeted to a particular, terminating service provider, which is not something in the original out-of-band framework. It's kind of more of a subscription model where, the terminating VSs will interface with the CPS, even potentially pulling from it rather than receiving these things asynchronously. So, I mean, there are a bunch of kind of optimizations in the implementation that fall out of this as well. Next slide. I think I've already talked to most of this. I mean, it really isn't very different in terms of the verification process, what you need to do from the baseline OOB framework. It is worth pointing out, this is a high-level architecture still in some respects. So when we say that each terminating service provider runs a CPS, that doesn't necessarily mean they operate it. Of course, it could be hosted. It doesn't necessarily mean that a CPS couldn't have kind of multiple tenants that it is fronting for. I understand there's already an implementation out there of this in the field that works that way. And so, we kind of gloss over some of that, but it doesn't change the fact that, again, getting the security requirements of this particular use case nailed down, fleshing out the REST interface a bit, and getting CPS advertisements, I think makes something that is implementable enough that we could credibly go out and say that it is a standard that people could do. Next slide. So yeah, I mean, my base question to all of you is, should we do this? Like I said, there's a parallel effort in ATIS. There is some parallel consideration as well in the GSMA around the space, though that is relatively early, and I think it's unclear which of several potential high-level solution directions they will take. But at the same time, I feel like it's worth documenting, again, the three things that I previously described, what the differences are in the threat model in this environment, how you would do these CPS advertisements well or poorly, because I believe there are ways to do them poorly. And I'm concerned that there will be implementations out there if we don't have something like this that might not take a good approach to CPS advertisement. And of course, the REST interface itself is, really just a sketch in the original draft, and we could do better. So given that, I'd be interested in hearing from the room. Do people think this is worth the STIR working group's time to do?
So let's go ahead and see if we can get some use out of this virtual hum tool. If you are interested in contributing to this draft in a working group setting, is the question. So I'm going to hit the start button. If you think this should be something the working group should take on and you will participate, hum. If anybody is not familiar with the hum tool, if you click on the square icon that has the 3 histogram bars at the top of the roster, it will take you to a panel with some choices that you can select. Three, two, one. So we got landed right in the middle. So given the size of this group, I would suggest that that's marginal interest, probably not enough to make a call for adoption on the working group list right now. If somebody is strongly interested in this, send in a review. It might attract some more attention to it. Does that feel right, John, or do you think that we...
Sure. I mean, I think this needs to be done. I think that there are groups that are already starting to chart this outside the IETF, and it would be really good if we gave some guidance to them, because generally speaking, when we don't, we are often unhappy with what happens as a result. But
Russ, is there another question that we could ask that would give more clarity to you?
I would like to know if anyone objects to this going forward in this group.
And this isn't a call for a hum. This is for people to stand up and object if they think that this is a wrong place.
That's what I had in mind.
Can I make a comment? I don't object to the work. I just, the caveat that I brought up, I want to make as clear as part of the work, but and I'm willing to review and provide my feedback for sure. But I don't object to it.
Yeah, I mean, and there's probably plenty we could flesh out about that gateway use case and the wise and unwise ways to approach that. So certainly I'd appreciate the backup.
Subir, you should have the floor.
Okay. Okay. So I think, John, thanks for, I think you mentioned about that lot of similar work going on other places, including GSMA. What would be your suggestion to approach to coordinate?
Well, I'm the editor of the GSMA spec.
Oh, you are the editor. Okay. I sense that, but I just wanted to get anyway. Okay, so thanks for the update.
But like I said, that is very preliminary, and there's actually a number of solutions that are under discussion there, and so that's still, I mean, very high level thinking there. But they need some out of band function that lets them get call detail records basically directly from origination to the termination side, and like there were only so many ways to skin that cat. They were talking about stir shaking before I got there. So I started listening in. The next thing you know, they're like, hey, do you want to edit this thing? So I'm like, okay.
So I assume that your objective is to do the work in IETF and then basically recommend to the other places.
Well, I think, we at the IETF, we're not the protocol police. We put out what we think are,
Sure.
valuable, vetted, secure solutions for this. And I think we have a pretty good track record of, if we're willing to go on record and say this is an okay way of doing this, people listen to us.
Okay, thanks.
Well, given this extra feedback, I think then a call for adoption to the list may be the right thing to do. That would certainly give anyone that did have any objections an opportunity to come forward.
Sounds good. I like that.
I think that's a good move here.
All right. I'm done, I believe. I'm done.
All right. So to do this dance one more time. All right, Brian.
You asked for video, but not audio. I think you need to ask for both.
There we go. Is that okay?
Hear you, but I don't see you, even though I approved it.
Don't worry about it. You don't need to see me. This is going to be quick. Let me just keep going. So I'm basically going to repeat what I said a little bit a while ago. So emergency calls are important. Validating that this is a good emergency call is really important. The thing that happens with spoofing, other than TDOS and DDoS, is swatting, where you call up 911 with a spoof telephone number and say, oh, my neighbor's house is being attacked, send the SWAT team. Regular STIR is fine for that. We don't really need anything special. But there is a document for defining how we do emergency calls on the internet at 6881. We don't currently have any specification for how you use the resource priority header for emergency calls, and that basically reflects old experience where the PSTN does not give any kind of priority to emergency calls. Newer networks have the capability to give some priority to emergency calls, and so moving forward with it, a way to at least ask for it is a reasonable thing. Next slide. So there is an ESNet resource priority namespace. It was defined by 7135. It gives us 4 levels. It was originally defined for use within the emergency services environment. So we have something called emergency services IP network, or ESINet, and that's where all the calls are sent to and then distributed among the the emergency call centers called PSAPs. And we use the namespace within the ESINet. But now we're thinking about being able to extend that so that you could request at least lower the ESNet 0.0 to request some priority for emergency calls. And we're not going to specify what that means. That is, any given network can decide what kind of priority it can give to resources within that. But if we're going to do that, if we're going to allow you to request resource priority, then we do need to protect the header. And that's what protecting the RPH would do for us. Next slide. There is the notion of callbacks. Occasionally, the emergency services need to call back the caller of an emergency call. They drop prematurely, or we need some additional information, things like that. So, as I said earlier, we needed marking for this. We needed to know that this was a callback, and the marking that was selected in RFC 7090 was the SIP priority header, which is not the resource priority header. And there's a value called PSAP callback for that header that marks this as a callback. And of course, we really would like to protect that against modification. We don't really don't want to be able to spoof that setting. It does not set as 7090, doesn't define the use of RPH. As I said before, we really didn't have any notion of resource priority in the past, but we're thinking that at least some networks might be able to provide it. So what we would like to do is to set the RPH to ESNet.0, and then again we would need to protect both RPH and SIP priority against modification. Next, I think that's it.
Yeah.
And that's all. That's it. So that's all this draft talks about. It introduces the problem. Now, what we've gotten out of the draft that we reviewed earlier is the actual mechanism for protecting the priority header and the resource priority header. And now what I need to do is to put a draft in, which I haven't done, but we'll do shortly, given we seem to be going ahead with this, which simply updates 6881 to say use ESNet.0 for RPH and use and the same for callbacks, which I will do. And that will be, again, will be a SIP core document, not a STIR document, the mechanism. That's it. Questions? Great. It was easy.
All right. So does anyone else have business for this group? You know, Eric had requested agenda time, but then indicated he couldn't be here. I'm not hearing anything. So thank you all for your engagement, and we'll see you. See you as we are working our way through our, pandemic-ridden world.
Hey, can I get in?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna give a little pointer. This was not something that I felt we needed to discuss this time, but I did revise my old connected identity draft, actually. And this is something that I am going to start putting some more energy into as things like OB and divert and so on are getting off of our plate, and delegation. And this connected identity draft is basically looking at an update to 4916, which was the original kind of connected identity for 4474, that looks at how you could get requests, how you could basically get STIR to work in the reverse direction, how you could get a request in the backwards direction, probably an update or something, to carry a passport so you could see who it is you ended up connecting to. This is a valuable property for a number of the things that we're trying to do with STIR, including, for example, SIP Brandy. And so that's work we just need to do. And there are a bunch of interesting kind of fraud-related use cases that fall out of that as well. So probably next time, I hope to flesh that out a little bit more than it is now. But that's something that I know I'll be bringing next time. And there was one other thing I wanted to raise as well that has come up a couple times now, which is whether there's much of an appetite in this group to start looking at messaging. And, basically there are a number of systems out there today that still use telephone numbers as the source of textual messages or mixed textual and graphical messages. And, although there have been some custom systems that have been developed to attest for those, I kind of feel like we will have failed in our responsibilities in STIR if we don't at least explain how STIR credentials could be used by those systems if those systems wanted to use them. And so Chris and I were talking about this, just kicking around the idea that we could create some kind of a framework document that isn't specific to any messaging system, but just says like, oh, if you're going to use like messaging with STIR, here's some ways that, for example, Passport could relate to that. Here's how, in particular, STIR credentials could relate to that. And I was curious if anyone thought that was an interesting or non-interesting thing for us to be doing. I see Mark giving thumbs up to connect identity and messaging. Good morning. Let's get to keep moving in.
So,
Anybody?
John, can you explain a little bit more? Ben Campbell and I wrote a document a couple of years ago about, SIP message and so on, and how to authenticate those. How would this be different?
Basically, the idea is to take 8226 credentials, and in particular, the different things that can be attested in a TN auth list, and explain their relevance in particular to messaging. Was that the approach you took? I don't remember off the top of my head.
More of the yes mime approach. Ben, you're in queue. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think we didn't really talk about the applicability of STIR.
No, we didn't.
And I think that's what John's talking about. And I find that interesting. I think there are interesting applications of that could relate both to the RFC that we did, and also back to maybe some kind of SIP brandy-like things, except for messaging.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea. It's just basically, I mean, if we've developed a system that is supposed to be able to attest that originating telephone numbers are good for personal communications, I kind of feel like we miss checking a box if we don't do messaging.
Okay, Chris?
Yeah, this is Chris. I was actually just purely going to ask, what is the state of that document? And I think you answered my other question, that it wasn't specifically STIR related, but certainly see the value, to amplify John's message that, it's sort of like the calling name thing. We left that off, and we knew we needed to do that. So I see messaging as a similar thing here.
Yeah, and just to Ben in the chat room, I think SIP Brandy, we went back and forth on this about how much we were going to require an update to 4916 to do SIP Brandy. And correct me if I'm wrong, Russ, eventually we just decided to punt, right? And we had like some text in there about how, yeah, you need to do something like connected identity for SIP Brandy to actually work. But we basically decided not to make that a normative dependency for SIP Brandy. But whether we should have or not is another question.
Right. Well, at the time we did it, yes. By the way, John, auth 48 now.
Yeah, I know. I need to do it. I saw your note. I'll reply. I know that. I was shocked to learn that that's in C238. Why is it in C238?
Because of the dependency on the ICE stuff.
Which shocks me. Like trickle ice or something depends on anyway. But yeah, I'll do it. But yeah, I mean, so we've always needed this for SIP Brandy to actually work. This is the point. Like, in order to get secure credentials in the backwards direction via SIP Brandy, we need a 4916 update. And it's not a big update from a protocol perspective, but yeah, we should have done this a long time ago, and it's just been, there's too much else going on for us to have done it. Right, so I'm seeing a lot of +1s for messaging. People seem to think that's a pretty cool idea. And again, I think there's a way to scope it. I think the trick is to scope it in such a way that anything that wants to use it, like if MLS wanted to use STIR credentials for some reason, what would that look like? That's maybe the only thing that I'd be willing to sketch, beyond just message or something. But I think we want to create something that's broad enough that it gives general guidance for applications that use messaging that might want to use STIR credentials, which we presume are going to become very common very soon, sometime after June of 2021. And so, yeah, I think we need to do it.
I'm supportive.
Okay, great. Well, so I'll take a crack at that. Chris and I will, on what a kind of initial messaging draft might look like. Yeah, I see MSRP too. We kind of get MSRP for free, I think. SIP Brandy should work for MSRP. Should we?
This is Chris. There's also RTT. I've seen some discussions about that too.
I mean, RTT is also a session that's negotiated with SDP and everything else, right? And so, right. I mean, anything that's negotiated like a SIP session is, we kind of get free with her.
Just putting it on the list.
Yeah. Yeah, we can point out the things that we think we get for free. That's probably worth doing. All right, but other than that, that's all I had. Just kind of teasers for things to come in the future.
Anybody else? Oh, thank you again, and we will see you online.
Okay, we're told to leave the room up just for a minute so that if anyone who's doing anything in CodeEMD in the embedded frame doesn't get it ripped out from under them.
And there's nobody doing anything over there, so.
Okay, then we can then we can end.
Check
All
you guys
right.
later.
I'm going to terminate the session. Take care.
Sounds good. Bye-bye.